Get out. Take your daughter and leave before I call the police.
We didn't do anything wrong, sweetheart.
Daddy, are they mad because we're not rich?
I told the guards to walk them out, to the street, in front of everyone. What I didn't know, that man was Marcus Bellington, and in his hand sat the $500 million, the only money left on earth that could save my dying company. 3 minutes, that's all it took. Before I take you back into that lobby, let me ask one small thing. If you're the kind of person who stays for the stories that show who people really are when they think no one is watching, subscribe and follow along, because the moment you're about to hear changed everything I believed about myself, and I'd like you here for the rest of it. 3 minutes to destroy everything, and I need you to understand how a person builds a life stupid enough to do it in the first place. My name is Vanessa Whitmore, and for most of my 41 years, I believed I could read a person the way other people read the weather. One glance at a coat, a handshake, a pair of shoes, and I thought I knew exactly who was standing in front of me, and exactly how much they were worth. I was born into money, educated at the kind of school that puts your name in a certain column for life, and the world had spent 4 decades confirming that my instincts were flawless. Nobody warned me that instincts polished by privilege are just prejudice wearing a nicer suit. I ran Whitmore Systems, the technology company my family name was stamped across, and from the outside it still looked like a fortress. Inside, it was burning. We were losing close to $8 million every month, and the last honest projection on my desk gave us 11 weeks of cash before the whole thing folded. 23 investment funds had already looked at our numbers and walked away. I had stopped sleeping. I had started smiling harder, because that is what people like me do when the ground is disappearing. There was exactly one name left on the list, and its name was Bellington Capital. I knew the fund. Everyone in my world knew the fund, the way you know a mountain you have never actually climbed. What I did not know was the man who ran it, and that gap turned out to be the most expensive thing about me. I had skimmed the file my team prepared, but I skipped the part about his childhood and his family, because in my mind those were just the soft public relations details you decorate a billionaire with. I had already built the man in my head. Tailored suit, an entourage, a certain accent, a certain ease. I was so sure of the shape of him that I never bothered to learn his face. The morning of the meeting, Marcus Bellington's babysitter had a minor accident on the way to his home and could not come. He had flown across the country for this, and rather than cancel, he brought his 8-year-old daughter with him. His assistant emailed my office that same morning to say the little girl would sit quietly in the hotel's waiting area with a book. I never read that email. I was too busy rehearsing the version of myself I planned to sell to a stranger who could save my life. I arrived at the hotel early, and I saw them almost immediately. A man in a plain gray shirt, no jacket, holding a folder in one hand and a small girl's hand in the other. She wore a little backpack and clutched a book against her chest, and she had her father's careful eyes. In another life, I might have found the picture sweet. That morning, standing in a lobby full of the kind of people I understood, I looked at the two of them, and my whole broken instinct machine lit up and told me a lie I was desperate to believe. He walked toward me, calm and unhurried, and held out his hand. "Miss Whitmore, I'm Marcus. I believe we have a 9 o'clock." I did not take his hand. I looked at the gray shirt, then at the child, and I decided in less than a second that this man could not possibly belong to the meeting I needed so badly. I decided he was a hustler, someone who worked hotel lobbies, who used a little girl to make wealthy strangers feel warm and generous. The idea that my last hope on earth might arrive dressed like an ordinary father never entered my mind, because I had already decided what saving looked like, and it did not look like him. "There must be some mistake," I said, and I heard how cold my own voice was. "This is a private meeting for serious investors." He stayed patient in a way that should have frightened me. "I understand the confusion. If you just check with your assistant, she can confirm the appointment." But I would not check. That is the part I cannot soften, no matter how many times I retell it. He handed me the exact thread that would have unraveled the whole mistake, and I refused to pull it because pulling it would have meant admitting my instinct might be wrong, and I had built my entire self on that instinct never being wrong. So instead I raised my voice, right there in front of 2 other investors and 30 strangers, and I said the thing that would follow me for the rest of my life. Don't bring your daughter here and think that's going to get you into this room. The little girl heard all of it. She looked up at her father, and I saw her small hand tightened around his, and she asked him, quietly, whether they had done something wrong. He knelt down to her level, and he was so gentle about it that it made my cruelty louder by contrast. He told her that she had done nothing wrong, that this was not about her. And something in that tenderness, some part of me that already knew I was the villain of this scene, only made me angrier. So I pointed at the door, and I screamed for them to get out before I called the police, and I told the security guards to walk them all the way to the street. 2 guards came. One of them would not meet my eyes, and I could tell he hated what I was making him do. But he did it anyway, because I was the most powerful person in the room, and that is how power works when nobody stops it. A few people lifted their phones. I did not care. I was certain I had just protected my meeting from a con. He never argued. That is what I remember most now. He gathered his folder and his daughter, and his jaw was tight and his knuckles were pale around that folder, and I understand now that his silence cost him something enormous. He was choosing not to let his little girl watch her father come apart in front of a woman who had already decided he was nothing. As they reached the door, I heard the child ask him if they had been thrown out because they were not rich, and he answered her in a voice steady enough to break your heart. He told her no. He told her they were thrown out because the woman inside had decided who they were before she was willing to listen. Then they were gone, and I fixed my jacket, and I walked into my meeting feeling like I had won something. I had won nothing. Within the hour, I was back at my own office, half of the incident already fading, mentally rehearsing for a board meeting, when my assistant came through the door with a look on her face I had never seen before. Dana Sullivan was not a woman who panicked. She had held my calendar together through 2 years of quiet collapse without ever once losing her composure, and now she was standing in my doorway holding a tablet like it might bite her. She turned the screen toward me without a word, and there he was. The gray shirt, the careful eyes. Marcus Bellington, standing between 2 heads of state at an economic forum, being introduced as one of the most influential investors in the technology world. Vanessa, she said very carefully, that's the man. That's Bellington Capital. That's the meeting. I want to tell you my first feeling was shame. It was not. My first feeling, God help me, was defense. Every excuse I owned came rushing up at once, and I started saying them out loud as if saying them fast enough could rewrite the last 2 hours. He should have said who he was. Anyone would have made the same assumption. Who dresses like that for a meeting worth $500 million? It was practically his fault for testing me. Dana let me finish, and then she said the quietest, hardest thing anyone had said to me in years. He did tell you who he was. You just didn't believe him. Our chief financial officer, Harold Finch, came in a minute later, and he was gray in the face. He confirmed what I already knew in my stomach. Marcus had spent 8 months studying us, our technology, our people, the exact shape of what it would take to bring us back from the edge. Bellington Capital had been preparing an investment of $500 million, enough to save the company, enough to protect 3,000 jobs and the 3,000 families attached to them. Harold told me something else, too, something that made the room tilt. Marcus was known throughout the industry for one particular habit. He watched how leaders treated the people who could do nothing for them. The waiters, the assistants, the single parents, the ones with no power in the room. And as a single father himself, a man raising a daughter alone after losing her mother, he had a special radar for companies that treated family as a weakness, as a sign that someone was not serious enough. I had failed the one test he actually cared about, and I had failed it in the loudest, most public way imaginable. I called his phone. Voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I wrote him an email, and I chose my words the way I always chose words, to protect myself. And I called the whole thing an unfortunate misunderstanding. Even then, in the wreckage, I could not stop managing my own image. That single word, misunderstanding, told him everything he needed to know about how little I understood. By early afternoon, the video was moving. A woman in a designer blazer pointing at a door, screaming at a man and his little girl to get out. And underneath it, captured clean by someone's phone, a child's voice asking her father if they were being thrown out for not being rich. It spread the way only genuine cruelty spreads. My phone rang, and it was Charles Delaney, the chairman of my board, and he did not bother with a greeting. He told me flatly that I had just thrown the only person left who could save this company out onto the street, and that I had done it in front of the entire internet. And that was the moment the walls of my life became a corridor with only 2 doors. Behind the first door, I could keep protecting the version of myself I had spent 41 years building. I could stay quiet, blame the moment, blame the shirt, blame the child, and I could watch 3,000 people lose everything so that I would never have to admit what I was. Behind the second door was something I did not yet have the courage to name. Standing in front of a man I had humiliated, admitting, out loud, in public, that I had looked at a black father holding his daughter's hand and decided he was worthless. Trading away every ounce of power I had left, on the small and terrifying chance that it might save everyone but me. I stood in my glass office, watching my own face scream on a stranger's phone screen, and I understood, for the first time in my adult life, that being right about everything had made me completely blind. For 2 days, I did the only thing I still knew how to do. I managed. I called Marcus Bellington's phone until it stopped even ringing through to voicemail. I sent emails in the careful, lawyered voice I had spent a lifetime perfecting, and every one of them was really about me. I apologized for failing to recognize an investor. I offered to reschedule at his earliest convenience. I wrote the word regret, and I wrote the word misunderstanding. And I sent those emails into a silence so total it started to feel like a verdict. Dana Sullivan watched me do it. She stood in my office on the second afternoon, arms folded, and she finally said the thing she had clearly been holding back. "Vanessa, you keep apologizing for not knowing he was rich. That's not what you did wrong." I turned on her before I could stop myself. I told her I had apologized, that everyone has a bad morning, that I was not the kind of person the internet was making me out to be. I told her I did not need a lecture from my own assistant, and she took it, the way people had always taken it from me, and that should have been my warning, because a person who only ever gets agreement has no idea how wrong she is allowed to be. Here is the ugly truth I could not say out loud yet. I wanted the problem to be about money. If the whole thing was simply that I had failed to recognize a billionaire, then it was a business mistake, and business mistakes can be fixed with the right phone call and the right check. But if the problem was the thing Dana kept pointing at, if the problem was that I had looked at a black man in an ordinary shirt, holding his daughter's hand, and decided he was nobody, then it was not a mistake at all. It was a confession, and I was not ready to read my own confession out loud. Meanwhile, the video would not die. It kept finding new people, and every new wave of them heard that little girl's voice asking her father if they were being thrown out for not being rich. And every wave of them decided, correctly, that they hated me. I told myself it would blow over. It did not blow over. It grew roots. And then it stopped being about me and Marcus at all, and that was so much worse. My own employees started talking. Not to me, never to me, but in the places where people talk when they have finally decided the risk of silence is worse than the risk of speaking. A woman from our product team wrote about being passed over for a promotion 3 years running because she left at 5 to pick up her kids, while men who stayed late and produced less kept climbing. A single father in our support division wrote about the performance review where he was called uncommitted for asking to work from home the week his son had surgery. Others wrote about being sized up in interviews by their clothes and their accents, about being quietly filed as not a culture fit because they had not gone to the right schools. And I read all of it in one long, sleepless night, and somewhere around 3 in the morning I understood something that terrified me more than bankruptcy. The scene in that hotel lobby was not an accident. It was not a bad morning. It was simply the loudest, most public version of 1,000 quiet decisions I had been making for years, and the culture I had built had been making right alongside me. While I was learning to hate my own reflection, the business kept dying on schedule. The client who had been threatening to leave finally sent the letter ending their contract, and 2 more began asking questions we could not afford for them to ask. Our valuation dropped like something falling off a roof. Harold Finch came to me with a new number, and the new number was under 10 weeks of cash, and it was still falling. I did the math on 3,000 families, and I could not make it come out to anything but catastrophe. So I did the only thing left. I flew to Bellington Capital without an appointment because I had run out of the luxury of pride. They made me wait in the lobby for over 3 hours, and I deserved every minute of it. And that lobby did something to me that no email chain ever could have. On the desks, in little frames, I kept seeing the same 2 faces. Marcus and the daughter he had brought to my hotel. His people kept pictures of his child on their desks, the way you only do when the person at the top has made it safe to be a parent out loud. And down a short hallway there was a bright room full of small chairs and books and soft light, a place the firm had built so that an employee who lost their childcare would never have to choose between their kid and their job. I sat there, and I understood, slowly and completely, that when Marcus brought his little girl to my hotel, he had not been unprofessional. He had been living the exact reality that millions of working parents live every single day. The reality my company treated as a character flaw. He had walked into my lobby carrying the truth of most people's lives, and I had called security on it. Finally, near the end of the 3rd hour, an assistant came and told me Mr. Bellington would give me 15 minutes. What I did not know, sitting in that chair rehearsing my apology, was how close he had come to refusing to see me at all, and that his reasons were not nearly as clean as I would have needed them to be. Part of him had wanted to let my company die, not out of greed, but out of something older and more human than that, something I only understood later. But none of that showed on his face when I walked in. All I saw was a man behind a desk in a plain sweater, the same careful eyes, and no warmth in them at all. I sat down, and I did what I had rehearsed. I apologized, and I told him that I had not known he was the person who ran Bellington Capital. He stopped me almost before the sentence was finished. "See, that's the part you keep getting wrong," he said, and his voice was quiet and even and much harder than any shout. "You're apologizing for not knowing how much money I have. That was never the problem. I started to answer and he kept going. Not loud, just immovable. The problem is that you looked at a black man in a regular shirt, holding his daughter's hand, and you decided he couldn't possibly matter. You didn't need to know my net worth to treat me like a person. You chose not to. I had no answer for that, because there was no answer that was not another excuse. Then he asked me the question that took the floor out from under me. Let me ask you something honest. If I'd walked in that morning wearing a $10,000 suit, alone, no kid, would you have called security? I opened my mouth and nothing came out because we both already knew. I could not say yes. The yes did not exist. "So tell me," he said. And now there was something almost tired in it. "Are you sorry about how you treated me? Or are you just sorry you found out I have $500 million that you need?" And that was the exact moment my whole life of being right about everything finally collapsed in on itself, because I could not find a single honest sentence that would save me. So for maybe the first time in my adult life, I stopped defending. And I told the truth. I told him that if he had been an ordinary single father, a man with no money and no power, I would probably have forgotten his face before lunch. I told him that the shameful part was not that I had misjudged a billionaire. It was that my cruelty had a price of admission, and he had only earned my attention by being able to pay it. Something shifted in the room when I said that. Not forgiveness, nothing that easy. But he looked at me differently, the way you look at someone who has finally stopped lying, even if you still do not like them. And then he did something I did not expect, something that changed how I saw him for good. He told me he was not going to sit there and pretend to be a better person than he was. He told me that when he hung up the phone that first morning and canceled the deal, he had felt something he was not proud of. A flash of satisfaction. A small, ugly pleasure at watching a woman like me fall. "You want me to believe you've changed," he said. Meanwhile, I'm sitting here trying not to let this turn me into a man who enjoys punishing people. Neither one of us is standing on the high ground we think we're on. I have thought about that sentence more than almost anything else anyone has ever said to me. In that moment, he stopped being the wronged saint of the video and became something far more useful to me. A flawed human being choosing, with visible effort, not to become the worst version of himself. He was not offering me grace because he was above anger. He was wrestling his own anger in front of me and choosing something better anyway, and that was 1,000 times harder than being a saint. The fight I was in changed shape right there. I had come to get my investment back. I walked out understanding that getting the money was no longer even the point. The only thing that mattered now was whether I could actually understand why he had thrown my deal away, and whether he could bring himself to believe that a person like me was capable of becoming someone else. I begged him, before my 15 minutes were up, to consider the 3,000 people who would lose their jobs for a sin that was mine and not theirs. I told him they should not drown because of what I had done. He agreed to consider it, but only on one condition. Before Bellington Capital would put a single dollar back on the table, his people would run an emergency review of the culture inside Whitmore Systems. A real one. Everything open. I said yes because I had no other move. I did not yet understand that I had just agreed to hold a mirror up to the thing I least wanted to see. The review took 11 days, and it was the longest 11 days of my professional life. His team talked to people at every level of my company, the ones with power and the ones without, and they were promised that nothing they said would come back on them. And what they found was not a story about one bad morning in a hotel. It was a story about years. They found that people of color left my company at a rate far higher than anyone else, and that almost nobody upstairs had ever asked why. They found that single parents were promoted less often than their peers with nearly identical performance. They found middle managers who quietly marked down anyone who needed a flexible schedule, treating a doctor's appointment or a school pickup as evidence of a person who was not committed. And they found the thing that made me physically ill to read. A few years earlier, someone on my own operations team had proposed a childcare support program for our employees, modest and affordable, and I had personally killed it. I had written, in an actual email that they put in front of me, that it did not move the needle on profit. I had looked at a program that would have let hundreds of parents keep their jobs and their sanity, and I had decided it was not worth the money. The man who had proposed that program, and who had warned me more than once about exactly the culture the review was now exposing, was our director of operations, a steady, quiet man named Dr. Nathan Reed. I had ignored him every single time, because he did not command a room the way I thought a leader should, and because being ignored is what happens to calm people standing next to loud ones. His warnings were all there in the file, dated, specific, and unheeded. The hotel was no longer a single ugly act by a single ugly morning. It had become evidence of a system I had spent years building, one careless decision at a time. My board saw it before I was ready for them to. They began, very quietly, to prepare to remove me as chief executive. And that is where I want to be honest with you about the worst thing I almost did, because I promised myself when I started telling this story that I would not make myself look better than I was. A crisis consultant my lawyers brought in laid out a path for me, and God help me, it was tempting. We could release a version of the review, a cleaned-up version, one that pushed most of the blame down onto individual middle managers who could be quietly let go. I could keep my name reasonably intact. I could survive. And for the better part of 2 days, I leaned toward it. I actually started down that road. I sat in a conference room and helped edit the document that would have buried the truth under other people's careers, and I told myself it was strategy. What stopped me was not a noble thought. It was one specific, anonymous testimony buried in the full report. A single mother on our staff had described, in plain language, the exact feeling of being made to feel that she and her child did not belong somewhere, of being looked at and silently judged as less. And I read it, and for the first time the thing did not reach me as an argument. It reached me as a feeling. Because I had put that exact feeling into a little girl's chest in a hotel lobby, and I had watched her look up at her father and ask if they had done something wrong. I would love to tell you that in that moment I became good. I did not. When I chose to release the full report, unedited, I was choosing it partly because I had finally understood, and partly because I knew, coldly, that any version I tried to hide would eventually be exposed and would destroy me even more completely. My motives were not clean. I have stopped pretending that people's motives ever are. But I made the right choice, for a tangle of reasons, and I have learned to let the rightness of the choice stand, even though the person making it was still only halfway to becoming someone worth trusting. I told Marcus the report would be released in full, and he came back, a few days later, with his final terms for the $500 million, and they were exactly as heavy as they should have been. I would have to publicly admit what I had done, and name it honestly as racial prejudice and bias against single parents, with no soft words hiding behind it. I would apologize to him, but I was expressly forbidden from ever putting his daughter in front of the cameras to make myself look sympathetic. The full results of the culture review would be published. A real childcare program and genuine flexible scheduling would be built for our people. The board would be reformed. Every employee who had been passed over because of their background or their family would have their case reviewed again, fairly. I would use my own personal money to fund support programs for single parents, and I would step down as chief executive of the company that carried my family's name. That last one took the air out of me. I had spent my entire life building my identity around that title. Take away the word chief executive, and I genuinely did not know what was left of me, which tells you everything about how empty the rest of me had gotten. To walk away from that chair was to lose my power, my status, and most of what I had spent a lifetime believing made me worth something. But if I refused, the company would close, and 3,000 people would lose everything, and I would have chosen my own name over their lives one final time. I learned later that Marcus did not hand me those terms in triumph. He told me, much further down the road, that he had sat with that last condition for a long time, asking himself an honest question. Was he demanding my resignation because it was right, or because some part of him still wanted to watch me lose everything? He never fully resolved it. He decided, in the end, that the resignation was the correct thing to require whether or not his motives were spotless, and he required it anyway, and he made peace with never being completely sure of himself. That, I have come to believe, is what actual integrity looks like. Not the absence of a lower motive, but doing the right thing while the lower motive is still whispering in your ear. I signed the agreement. We held the press conference in a room full of the same kind of cameras that had made me famous for all the wrong reasons. I stood at the podium, and I did not reach for a single one of my old, protective words. I did not remove Marcus Bellington from my hotel because of a misunderstanding, I said, and my voice was steadier than I felt. I saw a black man dressed simply, holding his daughter's hand, and I decided he could not belong in my room. I was wrong. Not confused. Wrong. A reporter near the front asked the question that everyone in that room was thinking, and it landed like a blade. If Marcus Bellington were not a billionaire, would you be standing here today? I could have deflected it, The old me would have deflected it beautifully. Instead, I told the truth, because the truth was the only thing I had left that was worth anything. "No," I said. "If he had been an ordinary father with no power, no one would have forced me to look at what I did. And that is the most shameful part of all of this. It should never have taken his money to make me see his humanity." The room went very still, and then it filled with the sound of 100 shutters. After the press conference, my board voted to remove me as chief executive, effective immediately. It was not a surprise. I lost the title, and then I lost the other board seats that had come with being someone, and the speaking invitations dried up within a week, and most of the reputation I had spent a lifetime assembling simply evaporated. The company that carried my family's name was going to be saved, and I was not going to be allowed anywhere near the saving of it. I drove home that night past our own headquarters, lit up against the dark 3,000 people's livelihood still intact inside it. And I understood that I had finally done one genuinely good thing, and that the reward for it was going to be losing everything I had ever used to measure my own worth. I had walked in wanting my money back. I walked out with nothing, having given away the only thing I had ever truly loved, and somewhere in the wreckage of that, without quite deserving it yet, I had started for the very first time to become a person. The board gave my chair to Dr. Nathan Reed, and I had to sit in a conference room and watch them do it. He was the same steady, quiet man I had ignored for years, a married father with a calm way of leading that I had once mistaken for weakness. Twice I had passed him over for bigger roles because he listened more than he talked, and never once tried to make himself the loudest thing in the building. Now I got to watch the man I had dismissed run my company better in a month than I had run it in the final 2 years, and there is a particular kind of humbling in that which I would not wish on anyone, and which I had entirely earned. Under Nathan, the full culture review went out, every unedited page of it, and something happened that I had spent my whole career preventing. People started telling the truth out loud. Employees stood up in meetings and described the times they had been marked down for the color of their skin, the sound of their voice, the school they had not attended, the marriage they did not have, the children they refused to pretend they did not have. And I had to sit with the fact that the scene in the hotel was never the disease. It was only the symptom loud enough to finally be heard. I started going to sessions on bias and on what it actually means to lead, and I want to be honest about how those sessions felt, because the honest version matters more than the flattering one. I sat in rooms where I was not the most important person, where I did not get to control the story, where I could not use money or title to end a conversation the second it became uncomfortable. For a woman who had spent 4 decades arranging every room around herself, that was its own kind of surgery, performed slowly and without anesthesia. And I will not pretend the change in me ran in a straight line, because it did not. There were days I still felt the old bitterness rise up, days I caught myself thinking the punishment had been too heavy, days I had to physically swallow the reflex to defend myself before it reached my mouth. Real change, I have learned, does not feel like a heart transformed all at once. It feels like choosing the right thing again and again when every old instinct in you is still reaching for the wrong one. Marcus did not forgive me, and he did not pretend to. He read the progress reports Nathan sent him, and he did not reply to any of them. And slowly I came to understand that I had no right to demand that he or his daughter do the work of making me feel absolved. Forgiveness was not a thing I got to schedule. It was not a deliverable. The hardest part of that entire year was continuing to change, even when it became clear that changing would not buy me back my title, my reputation, or the comfort of being told I was good again. Bellington Capital completed the $500 million investment, exactly as promised. Whitmore Systems stepped back from the edge, and 3,000 people kept the jobs that fed their families. And Marcus said one thing publicly about it that I have never forgotten. He said he had not invested to rescue me. He had invested to rescue the families who depended on the company, and to bet on the possibility that an organization could actually change once the truth was no longer allowed to hide. I heard later how he had finally made peace with his own part in all of it. He told a small group at the firm that he had stopped trying to prove to himself that his motives had been perfectly pure. He had wanted to punish me, and he had also wanted to do right by everyone whose livelihood hung on the company, and both of those things had been true at the same time. What he had decided, in the end, was simply not to let his anger be the thing that chose the outcome. He had chosen mercy without ever fully losing the anger, and I think that is braver than mercy that comes easy. Under Nathan Reed, the company did the real work, the unglamorous kind. They built the childcare center I had once killed with a single cold sentence about profit. They put in flexible scheduling for parents and for anyone carrying a family on their back. They reopened every promotion case that had been denied for the wrong reasons, and they went looking for talent in schools and neighborhoods my old company had never once bothered to visit. They built a way for people to report discrimination without fearing they would be quietly destroyed for it, and they rebuilt the board and the leadership from the inside out. After a year, Whitmore Systems was not merely surviving. It was stronger than it had been under me. People stopped leaving. Talented men and women who had spent years being overlooked were finally given room, and the products got better because the people making them were no longer spending half their energy defending their right to exist in the building. I kept every personal promise in that agreement. I funded the support programs for single parents out of my own money, and I kept going to the mentoring sessions long after anyone was making me, and I began sitting down with young leaders to tell them plainly about the exact shape of my failure. I never once called myself redeemed. I understood too well that an apology could not reach back into that lobby and erase what a little girl had already seen. The only thing that could ever prove I had changed was living differently for a very long time, and I had only just begun. A year after the day my finger pointed at that door, the company held its annual investor conference, and it held it in the very same hotel. Marcus came, and he brought his daughter, Emma, with him. This time the conference floor was full of people from every kind of background, and off to one side, near the light of the windows, someone had set up a small reading corner with books and cushions for the children of the people attending. The thing I had once thrown a family out for needing had become part of how the room was built. I stood near the door, and I was no longer the chief executive, and for the first time in my life I was not trying to be the center of anything. When Marcus and Emma walked in, I came toward them, but I did not put out my hand. Instead, I knelt down, the way her father had knelt for her a year before, so that I was level with her eyes. "A year ago," I told her, "I made you feel like you and your dad didn't belong here. That was wrong of me. You don't have to forgive me, and I'm not asking you to, but I wanted you to know that the two of you always deserved to be treated with respect." Emma looked at me for a long moment, and it was the look of a child who remembered everything and understood far more than the adults around her had assumed she could. She did not take my hand. She glanced up at her father, who did not decide it for her, who let the silence belong entirely to her. And then she said, in a small, clear voice, "I remember that day, that was all. No handshake, no soft resolution, no music swelling to tell everyone I had been let back in. She simply said that she remembered, and then she took her father's hand and walked past me toward the reading corner, and I stayed there on one knee, understanding at last that being forgiven was never something I had the right to expect, and that doing the right thing does not come with a guarantee of a warm ending. That, I finally saw, was the actual lesson, not the applause, the staying. Later, during the panel, someone asked Marcus why he had ever invested in the company of a woman who had humiliated him. "I didn't invest in the person Vanessa Whitmore used to be," he said, and his voice carried that same quiet steadiness I had once been fool enough to mistake for softness. "I invested in 3,000 employees, in the families who depend on them, and in the chance that an organization can change once the truth stops being hidden." He did not say that he had forgiven me. He only said that he had chosen not to let his anger decide the fate of people who had done nothing wrong. And I noticed that he left it there, honest and unfinished, exactly as it should be. Then someone turned to me and asked what had changed me the most, and I looked over at Emma, small in the reading corner with a book open on her knees, and I told them the truest thing I know. For a long time, I thought my worst mistake was throwing a billionaire out of a meeting, I said. It wasn't. My worst mistake was making a child believe that her father wasn't worthy of respect. Nobody should have to be rich or powerful or able to save a company to be treated like a human being. The story does not end with me being forgiven, because that is not the story that happened. It ends with Marcus and Emma Bellington walking freely into the very room they had once been dragged out of, and this time, not a single person in it asked whether they belonged. The real worth of a leader is never revealed in how they treat the investor holding billions of dollars. It is revealed in how they treat a father holding his child's hand, in the exact moment they are certain that person can do nothing for them at all. So I will leave you with the question I now have to live inside for the rest of my life. If Marcus Bellington had not been the man about to save my company, if he had only been an ordinary single father doing his best to take care of his little girl, would he have deserved that handshake from the very beginning? You already know my answer, and if this story made you sit with your own, stay with me. Subscribe and follow along, because I'm going to keep telling the ones that ask who we really are when the person in front of us can't do a single thing for us. The next time you find yourself deciding what someone is worth before you've bothered to listen, I hope you remember a little girl in a hotel lobby and the man who was worth everything long before anyone knew his name.